Hey, Bio30s. So, Unit B, the reproductive system, we're going to start with just the general concept of reproductive structures. With reproductive structures, the way they're formed is due to the presence or the absence of the Y chromosome or genes on the Y chromosome. So, when we get into the next unit, we will talk about the chromosome combination of sex chromosomes. So there's XX or XY for the most part. That's the majority of the time. There's some, chromosomal abnormalities or differences that can happen, but they are fairly rare. So two X chromosomes or an X and a Y chromosome are going to determine the structures that form in utero. So it's this Y chromosome in particular that has genes such as one that's called SRY or one that's called TDF, the testis determining factor. And the presence of that Y chromosome, or in some cases, the genes from that Y chromosome during a translocation, maybe to an X chromosome, but again, those are rare. The genes from that Y chromosome get turned on in utero, maybe around 5 or 6 weeks of that fetus's life. And what that does is it prevents the tubes that are forming inside, which were a part of something called the Mullerian duct, from forming ovaries, and instead they grow and downward and form testes. And then from there, the testes will produce testosterone and then form the other structures that are associated with what we would call the male reproductive system. If that Y chromosome or those genes from the Y chromosome aren't present, then the Mullerian duct will form the ovaries, and with that, the hormones and then the structures that we would consider part of the female reproductive system. So, for ease of describing, I will call them the male and the female reproductive system, simply based on the genetics of it. So, the presence of the Y chromosome forming what I'm going to describe as the male reproductive structures that form. So it's really just from a genetic basis and what the genes are that are causing the growth of the particular structures. No different than the genes for producing pigment in the skin might be more expressed than in one person than in another person, where we can have lighter and darker skin. So the genes are really determining the structures that we have. So I'll just go through the labeled parts here and I will try to highlight them as I talk about them. So we'll start with the testicles or the testes. They're the male gonads that produce sperm, which is the cellular component, as well as testosterone, a hormone. During the last 2 months of fetal development, the testes descend into a sac called the scrotum, and that it happens in the last 2 months. So, really, if you were to look at an ultrasound of a male fetus, you won't see the testes unless the ultrasound is done later. Now, often when an ultrasound is done later, though, the baby is a lot larger and crammed in there, so you can't really see a lot as it is. So if we look at what those structures are inside the reproductive system here, so here's the testis, and then there's the scrotum. And this is a side view, and it's important to be able to look at both a side view and like a front view, because there's two testicles. There'll be one just behind it in this particular picture. The next structure we'll talk about is the vasa differentia, or the vas deferens sometimes, but because there's two of them, it's the plural term. And they're the tubes that carry the semen from the testes to the urethra. And originally, it'll just be the sperm that's in it. So here's the vas deferens. And once it reaches just around here, it's going to turn into the next structure we'll talk about, the urethra. So the urethra here is a channel for both urine and sperm. So we call the structures of the male reproductive system urogenital, in that they carry both substances of reproduction and waste, whereas females, there'll be two separate structures. So that turns into the urethra right around here and will exit outside the penis. Some of the other, what we would call accessory structures of the male reproductive system, are those that are going to contribute to the production of seminal fluid or semen. And that fluid is secreted by three glands that are along this pathway of the vas deferens as it goes towards the urethra. So the seminal vesicle is the first structure, the prostate gland, and then the Cowper's gland, also called the bulbourethral gland. So the seminal vesicle is here, and there's actually two of them. Again, this is a side view, so there'd be one behind it. Then there's the prostate gland, and I'll color that in blue. It's a larger structure, and there's just one of those. And then there's the Cowper's gland, and I'll color that in red. And there's two of those as well. Each of those structures contributes substances to semen. So the seminal vesicle, the fluid that it produces, and what it'll do is the sperm is going to travel, if you follow the picture there, along the red and then down the yellow line that I've put. The seminal vesicles, for example, the green area, it's going to secrete fluid into that tubular pathway. So the sperm or the semen doesn't actually enter that vesicle, it just passes by it as the secretions are added. So semen is going to contain these three secretions as well as sperm from the testes. So they're coming up from the bottom there and the testes up through the vas deferens. So the seminal vesicle contains two substances, fructose and prostaglandins. The fructose provides energy for the sperm. Sperm have a lot of mitochondria in them because they've got a long way to swim, and they're going to need energy from sugar to be able to make ATP to move their tail. Prostaglandins are a chemical that cause uterine contractions. So when we think of it from a biological standpoint or evolutionary standpoint, having semen contain something that'll cause contractions in the uterus will increase the chance of sperm being drawn up inside the female body to reach an egg for fertilization. Because again, for the biological purposes, we can say that the purpose that the sperm have is to find an egg. So they're surrounding themselves in fluid that are going to help that happen. The prostate gland, the blue structure that I highlighted, secretes an alkaline substance. So think of basic versus acidic. And that's going to protect the sperm cells against the acidic environment of the vagina. And the vagina is acidic because it's an internal structure, and that allows it to be protective against bacteria and infection. The Cowper's gland also secretes an alkaline fluid, but it's just at the last part as the urethra and the vas deferens are joining. It secretes an alkaline mucus. It's a little bit of a thicker substance that's alkaline. And what that will do is it'll counteract any acidity that might have been left in the urethra from urination, because we're talking about a urogenital structure. So if we look up to the diagram here, there's the bladder. Right? So you're going to have those two areas converging to one another. So if sperm are going to be exposed to urine, they might die in that acidic urine. When it comes to these three glands and their secretions, these are the three fluid components or the non-cellular components of semen. The cellular component of semen comes from sperm. And sperm, again, is produced in the testes, and it's produced in a structure called the seminiferous tubules, which we'll go into on the next page. It's stored in a cap-like structure called the epididymis, which is just sitting right on top. I'll highlight it in green, and that's where it matures. And then it gets released into the vas deferens and follows that path where the secretions for semen are added to it. We can look at this similar structures, and I've put a color diagram on here, just so that we're able to see it from the front view as well. So you can see that there's two testes. The one on the right is showing a cross section. The other one is a full structure. And then they both have vas deferens. I'm just following with my yellow highlighter here. They both have vas deferens that move up. You can see the bladder is just sitting right behind here. There's the bladder. You've got the seminiferous tubules here. The seminal vesicle here in green. You have the prostate. I'll highlight that in yellow. And then the bulbourethral gland, which is written on the side here, that's just the Cowper's gland. So that I'm just highlighting in red there. And when you look at the pathway that the sperm take, they're going to start here in the seminiferous tubules, up the vas deferens. They're going to pass the seminal vesicle, go through the prostate, past the Cowper's gland, and exit out of the penis. And that will be on both sides. A vasectomy is a surgical procedure that involves the cutting and the cauterization, so it's sort of like the burning of the tubes of the vas deferens. And the purpose is for birth control, so it's preventing sperm from being a part of semen. So a person who has had a vasectomy and it doesn't have sperm in their semen, they'll still produce semen, but they just won't have any sperm in it. There's an ejaculatory duct, which you can also see highlighted here. inside, just kind of inside the entrance to the prostate, and that regulates the movement of semen into the urethra. Because it's a urinogenital gland or a structure, you don't want both of them happening at the same time, so it allows for regulation. You don't need to know tons about the sperm cell, but in terms of its function that make it important in reproduction, we need to understand that it's streamlined, and it's going to allow it to swim faster. So its structure is designed for its function. It's got a long way to travel for a tiny little sperm cell. It has a reduced cytoplasm, so it's still a cell. You can see the cell is actually in the top part here. That's the actual cellular part. But it's reduced cytoplasm, so it doesn't have a lot of cytoplasm in it. And with it, it doesn't have a lot of organelles in it. The only organelles it has is the nucleus. So it has its nuclear contents because that's what will be contributed to the egg. And it has an acrosome, which is similar to a lysosome with digestive enzymes in it. There are mitochondria in the sperm, but they're in the midpiece. And that midpiece mitochondria helps propel this tail and allows it to swim fast and far with the energy that's coming from the fructose. The process of spermatogenesis essentially means the generation or production of sperm, and that's going to occur in the testes in the structure called the seminiferous tubules. The seminiferous tubules are surrounded by structures called interstitial cells. They're the ones that are going to secrete the testosterone. The seminiferous tubules are the structures that are going to allow the sperm to develop. The spermatozoa, which you don't need to know the specific structures, you really just need to know sort of a germinal or a primary sperm cell, and then it goes down to a sperm cell. But spermatozoa mature into a sperm cell when they're in the epididymis, that cap-like structure on the top of the testes, and they mature there until they're ready to be released. And then you have another structure called Sertoli cells that support the nourishing or support the sperm cells and nourish them while they're developing. So in this little scroll here, we're going to say that this is also unit C. When we do unit C, we're going to sort of refer back to this diagram in terms of looking at the number of chromosomes. The main part that I want you to see here is I want you to see the cross-section of the testis here, and you can see the coiled seminiferous tubules inside. It's sort of like spaghetti all packed inside, and the sperm are produced inside that spaghetti. And if you were to take one of those pieces of spaghetti here, you can see, and just look down the end of it, you can see all of the sperm-lined sides around that cross-section of the seminiferous tubule. And then if we zoom just that one area in, even more so, you can see quite closely, you have these sort of original going to be sperm cells that eventually form sperm cells down here. And here you can see the Sertoli kind of area. The sustentacular area is the Sertoli area. When we look at a cross-section like this one, but if we were to take the cross-section right from the testis, you can also see the interstitial cells. So I'll color here, the interstitial cells are surrounding the seminiferous tubules. So there's your interstitial cell. And then these here are your seminiferous tubules. And as you can see the sperm cells as they're maturing. Let's use a different color. Down towards the center here, down towards this lumen area. And then they're going to swim down the lumen, down the length of that spaghetti to the epididymis where they're going to go and mature. Hormonal control of the male reproductive system is the primary hormone is testosterone, and it's produced in the interstitial cells of the testes, like I showed you on the first page. It's those cells found between the seminiferous tubule. And that Y chromosome, not only did it contain genes that cause the formation of the testes, but it also contains genes that causes testosterone production. Testosterone has two main functions. The first is to stimulate spermatogenesis, and the second is to initiate the development of secondary sex characteristics. So those really are sort of the puberty characteristics that we tend to talk about. It's an easier way to remember them. So if we look at testosterone or the male reproductive hormone feedback loop, I'm not going to draw stimulus because it's sort of a constant thing that's happening a little bit more during puberty, but really over the entire life of that person. So we'll just draw right into the hypothalamus, no stimulus. And so this is going to look pretty similar to what we saw in the reproductive system. So we have the hypothalamus and we have the anterior pituitary. There's going to be some differences though. So it's a little bit more complicated, but now we have a grounding of what the endocrine system feedback looks like. This one's not so bad. The hypothalamus secretes a releasing hormone, and in particular, it's called GnRH, and that's gonatotropic releasing hormone. And it's releasing hormones that are going to target structures in the gonads. So if this is a male, it's going to be the testes. If it's a female, it'll be the ovaries. So the anterior pituitary actually gets targeted with two hormones. It gets targeted with FSH and LH once by the GnRH when it hits the anterior pituitary gland. Now, instead of drawing a small box here, I'm actually going to draw a larger box. And this larger box is going to represent the testes. And we have two structures in the testes that we talk about. We talk about the seminiferous tubules. And the interstitial cells. So those are both inside the testes. And each of these hormones, FSH and LH, are going to target different sides of the testes. So the FSH targets the seminiferous tubules for sperm production, because that's where the sperm is made. The interstitial cells are going to be targeted by LH for testosterone production. And so it's like a feedback loop, but there's a few factors that happen. And it's not just one target that's being targeted, like we saw in most of the endocrine system hormones that we talked about. So when sperm production has reached a point where, the testes have enough and it's going to be a regular cycle all the time. And if they don't get used, they're going to die. Anyway, inside the body, they just get taken up, but otherwise they get released from the body. Either way, it's a constant production over that person's life span. But when that sperm production is halting at that moment in time, we're going to get feedback to both the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus, negative feedback, to shut that process off. Similar when we go to the testosterone side. And then there's one difference here that we didn't see a lot of in endocrine system, but testosterone also has an effect on sperm production. The higher the testosterone, the higher the sperm production. So that's actually a positive feedback there. So that's where we have one positive feedback loop that exists in the reproductive structures to a point. So if somebody's taking synthetic testosterone for bodybuilding, for example, there'll be a point where there can only be so much sperm production that it might actually overstimulate the testes and reduce it to a significant amount. But in a normal cycle, testosterone actually influences sperm production and is really the regulating hormone as a person matures outside of puberty as the hormone that actually maintains sperm production over the rest of that person's lifespan.